Good afternoon and welcome to Africa Speaks. Today we're going to do the show a little differently to pave way for a discussion that you too would like to participate in with our guests, and that's about the ICC versus Africa. Now, we start by asking a question. Is it a better Africa without the ICC as watchdog? That's the question we are asking you. And the hashtags this afternoon are ICC versus Africa and Africa Speaks. Now, the International Criminal Court is a very famous institution across the African continent, mainly because of the cases facing majorly Africans, the latest being President Uhuru Kenyatta of the Republic of Kenya and his deputy William Ruto. And 122 countries are state parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Out of them, 34 are African states. 18 are Asia-Pacific states, and about 18 from the Eastern Europe, 27 are from Latin America and the Caribbean states, and 25 are from Western European and other states. Now, the International Criminal Court, governed by the Rome Statute, is the first permanent treaty-based International Criminal Court established to help end impunity for perpetrators of the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. These crimes include genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The ICC is a court of last resort. It will not act if a case is investigated or prosecuted by a national judicial system unless the national proceedings are not genuine. For example, if formal proceedings were undertaken solely to shield a person from criminal responsibility, and in addition, the ICC only tries those accused of the gravest crimes. Now, let's look at the situations and the cases. We're having 18 cases in 8 situations that have been brought before the International Criminal Court. To date, 4 states parties to the Rome Statute, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and Mali have referred situations occurring on their territories to the court. In addition, the Security Council has referred the situation in Darfur, Sudan, and the situation in Libya, both non-states parties. In Kenya, we see a situation of crimes against humanity now on trial in The Hague. The African Union at the Jubilee or the 50th anniversary in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, went against the ICC. The ICC is now accused by some critics for humiliation of African leaders, interference with sovereignty of African states, with some leaders now suggesting that African Union countries pull out from the Rome Statute if we're going to see the indictment of sitting African presidents. And now joining us in studio to discuss this very grave issue that is keeping a lot of people awake because of the fact that, you know, African leaders seem to portray that they are being witch hunted by the International Criminal Court. And to discuss this very hot issue in studio with us is Harun Dubi, the director for Haki Focus, who is here to talk about why we need the ICC. And we also have Kibe Mungai, an advocate, who is here to tell us why we don't need the ICC. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
You're welcome.
To start with, I don't know whether to start with Kibe. For the obvious reasons, I'm not going to start with you. I'll start with Harun. Harun, why do you think we need the ICC in Africa?
Actually, the question should be, why does anyone think we don't need ICC? First, there is the very basic principle of criminal law, that criminal law is enacted to address future actions of crime. When the statute was enacted, it was enacted to deal with future crimes, grave crimes such as crimes against humanity, like you mentioned, genocide, war crimes, and now from 2017 there will be crimes of aggression. Those are very, very specific crimes that are of such magnitude and based or founded on impunity and state complicity that you need another force that is not within the state to deal with, so that such levels of impunity are dealt with. So the ICC, either call it ICC, call it another court of international repute, with criminal jurisdiction over nations, is an important deterrent against possible people who may cause such kind of crimes to happen in their countries.
Right. And Kibe, if I might hear from you, you seem to be very opposed to the fact that, the ICC is in Africa. Do you think the ICC is witch hunting African leaders?
Let's start generally first with my objections, and I would have three. And historically,
The first one.
I need to state that I was a supporter of the ICC until I became disillusioned with it.
What drove you
There
towards?
are three reasons why I have. Number one, originally when I believed in international justice, which is something that many lawyers believe in, because the world has experienced genocide, crimes against humanity, those are not good things, whichever way you look at it. And therefore, the notion of an international criminal court that would ensure Americans, Chinese, Israelis, and the big boys who actually undertake crimes against humanity, equally with those ones from Africa, would face international justice, that was good for me. But increasingly, which is the first reason, it is obvious that that court is not for Israelis, is not for Americans, is not for Russians. So let's stop the hypocrisy. Until the day when it is possible to have a court with jurisdictions over everybody, the Chinese, Americans, and Israelis, that day then we can talk about an international criminal court.
But
if
don't
it is
you
not
think
international, we also don't have any obligations to be in such international court. The second reason tied up to this is this, that you do not want a court and which under the current member states, the African states, their role is to produce accused persons, and the other roles are to sit in judgment over you, okay? Because as we talk as of now, and with the UN Security Council, which has countries that are not even members of ICC, they can refer matters to ICC, okay? In the foreseeable future, as long as you have the support of Russians, like the Syrians, you will never go to ICC. If you have the support of the Chinese, the UN Security Council will never refer the matter to ICC. And therefore, for that reason, this becomes selective justice. Anybody who genuinely believes in true justice must also of necessity be offended by the notion of selective justice. That reason is this, the Kenyan experience itself. When this case was put forward, and I've said this several times, I'm not saying it for the first time, we call it post-elections violence. The post-elections violence was about the fact that Raila Odinga never became the president of Kenya.
Well, let's
the
leave
war,
it.
Just wait for a reason. You've asked me for my reason.
Yes.
The war was about that. So that for me, at the basic level of justice, if you have any single persons to go to ICC in Kenya, and you do not have the principal beneficiary of the crimes that were visited in Kenya, it's a big joke. And I cannot be party to such kind of an action. And therefore this process, as far as I understand it, it is a miscarriage of justice, and it has always been.
Miscarriage of justice.
To that later.
Harold, what do you think about Kibe's thoughts in regard to his disillusionment?
Listening to Kibe, one gets this very disturbing view that he is saying, if you can't punish all the guilty, then do nothing about crime. Right. That is really the summary of everything he has said about his reasons for disillusionment. One, I suspect Kibe knows that ICC is a court of last resort. Each member state or nation is supposed to have instruments that deal with crime or impunity satisfactorily. When a state is either unable or is unwilling to deal with crimes against, the crimes that fall under the jurisdiction of that court, then the ICC's jurisdiction is invoked in many ways. And I don't think that we are going into the technicalities of how it is invoked. However, when there is that reality, is a political reality about the choices that Americans made that they are not going to be party to the ICC, it is twofold. One, because their systems work, and two, because generally the systems in other countries that have refused to be part of the ICC work. The ones that he's saying about Africans being the countries, the continent that produces accused persons, that is patently untrue.
But what does this say about the African continent? Does it say that we are at we're at a time where we cannot handle our cases?
That's the question.
And that is exactly
question I want to answer you.
Why we went to the ICC, because our judicial systems were not strong enough, were not qualified enough in some instances, and did not have the capacity to try cases of that magnanimity.
No.
I hadn't concluded my reasoning, and I think that question actually was falling in place with what the statement was going to make, that our systems in Africa have not worked. I would like Kibe or anybody who is who is against that court as a court to say the events as matters of fact that have led to these people being indicted or being referred to ICC for investigation have not taken place, or if they didn't take place, or if they did take place, they are not of the magnitude that would qualify for the threshold for the ICC. That is not the argument, because as a matter of factly, those crimes alleged to have been committed in Kenya were committed. Whether they were committed by the accused persons or not is a judicial matter for determination.
Right.
And
but what about the other African countries?
Now, what happens which would happen for Africa or even in Kenya is there is always a trend. You will find the police at a police station. If each police station today, if you went, you would find that there is a graph about various crimes and their trends, because they do that either as empirical research or perception. When they determine that there is a particular category of crime prevalent in a particular area, they lay strategies with dealing with that. Now, Africa, instead of quarreling about the ICC, where are we being targeted and they are not being targeted, they should ask themselves, why is this nature of crime prevalent in this continent, so that we should be dealing with it internally as Africans to ask ourselves this question, not to politicize judicial processes and fail to answer the factual political questions that lead to the kind of crimes that the ICC is dealing with. I think it is really escapism, a false sense of pride, nationhood, sovereignty, which does not address the fundamentals of justice and happiness in our continent. Talking about the leaders of Africa being treated badly, or they are being embarrassed, just like some people have said that this court is humiliating Africans. They are not talking about the victims of the African leaders who humiliate people by killing them, committing murders, rapes, and such kind of crimes.
Well, Harun, hold that thought right there. Now, let me just take you to what some of the African leaders said during the 50th anniversary of the African Union that was in Addis in Ethiopia. Some of them actually seem to think that the ICC is no longer relevant to the African continent. Just take a look at what some of the presidents did say.
African countries are signatory to the Rome Statute. But I think this thing is turning against them, against the presidents of Africa. Now, the way has been shot forward by the Republic of Kenya in handling their own case of indictment of the President Uhuru Kenyatta. In Sudan, President Bashir is also indicted. The indictment of sitting president is what I want this hall really to focus on.
They were taking us to local courts in our own countries. Why should we be going somewhere else?
What would be your proposal in dealing with matters of justice in relation
to if when you are talking of justice, you're the Kenyan people, if during the struggle or during the elections you killed each other, bring the people who killed you.
I was one of those that supported the ICC because I abhor impunity. However, the usual opinionated and arrogant actors, using their careless and shallow analysis, have now distorted the purpose of that institution. They are now using it to install leaders of their choice in Africa and eliminate the ones they do not like.
Well, there we go. Some of the African leaders on the ICC. We saw President Salva Kiir of South Sudan and President Sata of Zambia, as well as President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, giving their views on the ICC, and all of them are against it. And they're actually saying, you know what, why don't we have an African ICC, since it seems all the cases that are being tried at The Hague are all African. Mr. Kibe, what do you have to say about that?
I actually agree. One of my fundamental reasons is what President Museveni talked about,
yes.
Shallow analysis. And the situations of Kenya is one of an extremely shallow analysis. He talks about victims. I'll talk about Nakuru district. Nakuru district, if you remember what happened during the clashes, had more people who were killed, houses destroyed and all that. Those people who killed, the majority of them, and who got injured, are the supporters of PNU, as characterized by Moreno Campo.
Right.
Then, I'm talking about shallow analysis. Then now, when you see that from Nakuru district, there is no case for purposes of the victims in that county who are killed. If anything, from Nakuru district, there is a case against Uhuru Kenyatta. Okay? So that if you are to do a good and proper analysis, based on evidence, one would be more interested that if the greater victims are PNU, you'd want to have accountability for purposes of those who are killing PNU supporters in Nakuru County. Number two, equally importantly, you look at the case against William Ruto and Josiah Lapsang, for example. When you hear Bensouda talking about Ruto was seeking for power, it's a naked lie. Even crazy people know in Kenya Ruto was not seeking for any power.
Well, Ruto was not seeking for any power.
Year.
Let's
so
just
that,
see.
let me finish the thought, like you allowed Harun Dubi. The thing would be this, that if, for example, you take a case against William Ruto, which is a complete fiction, even if we were to assume for the sake of argument that crimes against humanities were committed in Eldoret and in Nandi counties, then the reasons would be crimes have been committed, but the wrong case has been taken to ICC.
Well,
based
if the
on
wrong
fiction,
case has been taken to the ICC, how
that
would
a certain violence was perpetrated?
How would we
in
assess?
order to make somebody president?
Exactly, but how do we assess the other African countries' cases? Let's take a look at Charles Taylor. If he hadn't been moved to the ICC, who would have had the courage? What judicial system in Africa would have had the courage to even try him? Because what would they be accusing him of?
There was consensus, for example, with Charles Taylor, that he was a war criminal. I think Charles Taylor's position, there is consensus across the world, including in his country. The problem in Kenya, and that is why it has always been a challenge to ICC, is that for purposes of the events in Kenya, who are the true war criminals, okay? That's number one. And the second issue also, for purposes of Kenya, is that the scale and the involvement of one Kofi Annan, in which at some stage, the ICC prosecutions, their main motivation was to ensure that the succession of President Kibaki would go a certain particular way. Thank God that was defeated in the last general elections. And this is why these cases are going to collapse.
No,
so that this
Kibe, just hold a second. Let's get to what
the one that is completely
let's get to what people are saying on social media here. And on Twitter, we're having Anthony Nyasimi, who is saying the ICC is of impeccable credibility and deserves Africa's collective support and participation. And we also have Fred Kennedy, who is saying Museveni is the reason. Well, this is quite... he opposes the ICC at some point, then he goes ahead to request it to arrest Kony. And then we also have one that's coming in here from Wandera Kennedy, who is saying, just remind Kibe that if Raila was indicted at the ICC, they wouldn't dare pull out. That is politics. And we also have Stephen Machua, who is saying, well, you're just giving a compliment. And we'll have one that's coming in from Akello Jeff, who is saying, Africa without the ICC is Africa with a whole lot of dictatorship states and human rights violations. Now, Mr. Harun, I would like to hear from you. If we are to pull out of the ICC, do you think that there are very grave repercussions or consequences that Africa might regret?
perhaps I will answer that question, but I wanted to reflect on what Kibe said and what I had Museveni and Salva Kiir talk about.
Yes.
We've become a country, or perhaps even a continent, that bases our logic on examples and other people's words rather than empirical thought, what he calls the lack of deep analysis. I'm saying we actually lack even that deep analysis, even from their standpoint. Why do I say this? The question to address ourselves to is whether the issues addressed by ICC happened in Africa. Did they? Did the African continent do anything to address those crimes? Has it done anything to address those crimes whenever they happened? If the answer is yes, I would like to hear Kibe Mungai or Museveni or anybody saying, yes, we have done the following. Like someone has already pointed out, Museveni is the one who requested ICC to intervene in Uganda to deal with Joseph Kony.
That's right.
But coming to your question, what would happen if Africa pulled out of the ICC? A, Africa is not in the ICC as Africa. Each member state, which is sovereign,
34 of them.
34 of them, which are sovereign, howsoever they conceptualize and contextualize their sovereignty, they are there as independent individual states. So there is now collectivity of Africa there. Two, the African Union is not a member or signatory to the ICC. It has no relationship other than a cordial diplomatic relationship where ICC, I think, has an observer mission in Addis Ababa. Africa should be asking first politically to say we also want observer mission or status with the ICC if they want to have that kind of, may I not use a very hard word, but that kind of feel-good kind of attitude. But like I said in my opening remark, I said international crime or crimes, laws against crime are enacted to deal with the future. If Africa pulled out, or African states pulled out of the ICC individually, but in the collectivity as African states, what really that will mean is that there is no buffer between citizens who are likely to be harmed by despots in the future who would cause that kind of crime, because ICC may not be there. But that's not entirely true nonetheless, because the Security Council will continue existing and will refer situations to the ICC, such as in the case of Sudan, even when Sudan was not a member of ICC. So this is pulling out is a political statement, but it's not necessarily a legal situation. In fact, it's likely to aggravate how Africa is perceived by the rest of the world. In fact, this argument by African states, in my view, is a subtle, thoughtless admission that Africans are inferior. How did we first sign into the treaty?
Exactly.
Why do we want to pull out because America is not there? So
and then that is where it began.
And yet we are begging.
Are we now saying that we have judicial systems that can try certain crimes without fear or favor?
Can you ask
Kibe, I would like to hear that from
things.
you, because we're running out of time.
Number one is that even the judicial system that we had in even before the new constitution was never given a chance to deal with the election violence that we had. I think I've always said, and Harun Ndubi is aware of this, that the commission of the Waki Commission got itself into a legal misadventure in terms of their thinking. So that under the ICC treaty, the judicial system that was supposed to ensure that there was punishment was the one that existed. But the Waki Commission started to go saying, go amend this, go and replace the existing system with the other one. When that failed, then they paved the way for Kofi Annan to take people to The Hague. It is important to remember that the first crime, unfortunately, the Attorney Generals we have had never seems to understand the importance of this point, that the first problems of Kenya was the illegality of the Waki Commissions itself and the recommendations that it made. Therefore, to say with a clear face that the Kenyan system failed, it never failed. What failed is the system proposed by the Waki Commission. Number two, under the new constitution
let's hear what Harun has to say.
Under the new constitutions of Kenya,
Kibe, just a second, as we wind up, let's hear what Harun has to say.
You must not be allowed to propagate a dishonest opinion on national TV.
This is honest.
Honest to yourself, but dishonest because it is intellectually dishonest.
All
right, gentlemen, as we wind up, I would like to hear your final stands on why exactly you think African nations should stay at the ICC and not withdraw from the Rome Statute? I'll start with Harun and we'll wind up with
Very
Kibe.
well. As I answer that question, the first thing is that the rationale for the Waki Commission was precisely for the failure of the systems. So starting to blame Waki, blame Kofi Annan, blame everyone else,
the system still failed.
Kibe is speaking like the good defense lawyer is. I don't know why Uhuru Kenyatta or William Ruto or Sang have not hired him. These are the arguments I expect in that court to say this thing shouldn't be here, jurisdiction, and it will be defeated like he knows. But why should Kenya or African nations stay in ICC? I already answered that the potential for violence has been demonstrated, that we have committed, as Africans, we have committed those crimes for which we are being tried. Charles Taylor has been convicted. We have seen people in the ICTR be convicted.
They've been convicted, but we haven't seen them going to prison. And that's the question that is
What do you mean?
remains.
Charles Taylor is in prison as we speak.
Well,
the
he
mayor
is in
of
prison,
Kigali is in prison
but
as we
some
are
of them
speaking.
are. You see, the issue that some people don't really understand is the fact that we have these people who are tried at The Hague, and then, you know, the trial goes on and on and on. It kind of makes Africans think that there is not enough evidence for these people to be tried. Even looking at the Kenyan case, you see that the ICC is really struggling to get evidence to these cases, and that is why Africa is saying, you know what, maybe we can do a better job at this rate.
That is an interesting view to look at, to even hold, to say Africa is thinking we could do a better job without doing anything at all. I mean, how can anybody try to argue and say, let these things go to Africa? In fact, it is very interesting, almost tragicomedy, when we say, let us have these things tried in Africa, let the cases come back to Kenya. And then with the same breath you say, you cannot try our presidents. You wait until they are out of office. You cannot humiliate big men in Africa. That is an oxymoron. It can't fit. They are opposing
So we
views.
actually need to stay.
The ICC is a judicial system. The trouble, I think, with many of us is that we are looking at it as some kind of edifice block outside there, rather than seeing it as a judicial system to which we have accredited ourselves and signed into it, that this is a judicial process will be taken. Never mind the miles, the thousands of miles between here and The Hague, but the ICC is a judicial system that has legal and constitutional jurisdiction to deal with circumstances such as happened in this country.
Great. Well put. And now, finally, Kibe, if you can really, in a nutshell, summarize your opinion on why we need to pull out of the ICC in about 30 seconds.
1 minute. Three reasons. Number one, a wise man
yes.
always changes his mind, or even a wise woman. In the case of ICC, the original signing of the ICC treaty has turned out to be a mistake in retrospect. Now that we are wiser and with a good constitution that would protect us from war criminals and people who commit crimes against humanity, we no longer have any business being in it. Let us deal with it here in Kenya.
Locally.
Number two.
Yes, I hope that's the last one.
There will be another one. Number two is this, that the major democracies, America, India, Russia, and we count ourselves amongst them, Kenya. Now, they are not members of ICC. ICC is a minority court. It has got no claim to the word international criminal justice system.
Right. We'll leave it at that because
finally,
for the one sole reason that we are out of time. Kibe, forgive me, I just have to cut you short.
That is okay.
And we're out of time now, but these two gentlemen, I'm sure, would actually have an endless conversation if we were to talk about the ICC versus Africa. And clearly, Kibe Mungai is against the ICC. He wants African nations to pull out from being signatories to the Rome Statute, while we're having Harun Ndubi, who is saying, look, we just have to stick right there because the judicial system's not quite satisfactory. This conversation continues online under the hashtag ICC versus Africa and Africa Speaks. My name is Joy Doreen Bira. Good afternoon.